Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon from the East Coast of North Carolina. Welcome to another edition of SIBA's Reader Meet Writer. I'm your host, Wiley Cash. I'm a novelist living and working in North Carolina. I'm also the 2019 recipient of SIBA's Pat Conroy Legacy Award, and I serve as the writer-in-residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. So perhaps you are here today because you registered or were invited by your local independent bookstore. Well, SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance, and SIBA is an organization that represents almost 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. So if one of those bookstores is the reason you are here today, please support them by purchasing Adam's book from the bookstore that brought you and not that website, that obscure website named after a river somewhere else in the world. We want to support our independent bookstores. They are the backbones of our literary communities. They are the voices in the wilderness out here in these democratic times, quote unquote. But today is a very special episode of Reader Meet Writer. We have Adam Rutherford, whose new book, How to Argue with the Racist, has just come out. He'll be joining us in just a moment. But before he does, I want to remind you, if you have questions for Adam during today's talk, he's going to have a presentation with some slides and some interesting things to share with us. Go to the chat button at the bottom of your screen and type in your question for Adam, and I will share it with him at the end of the show. When you type in your question, make sure to mention your name and the name of your local independent bookstore so we can say your name on the air and give a shout out to your favorite independent bookstore. So please do that. I will share your questions at the end, but keep them coming throughout today's talk. So I want to introduce our guest, Adam Rutherford. He is a geneticist, science writer, and broadcaster. He studied genetics at University College London, and during his PhD on the developing eye, he was part of a team that identified the first known genetic cause of a form of childhood blindness. As well as writing for the science pages of The Guardian, he has written and presented many award-winning series and programs for the BBC, including the flagship weekly Radio 4 program, Inside Science, The Cell for BBC 4, and Playing God for the leading science series Horizon. He is also the author of How to Argue with the Racist, an incisive guide to what modern genetics can and can't tell us about the human difference, and also a number of other books. But I'm thrilled that he is here with us today, so I will turn it over to you, Adam.
Well, thank you, Wiley. That was a very kind introduction, and it is a real pleasure, like you said, to talk to independent bookshops, because yes, they are the backbone of the bookselling communities. And I don't know what river you were talking about. There's the Thames here, the Potomac. I don't know which one you mean. Anyway, yeah. So the new book is called How to Argue with the Racist, which I know is a sort of provocative title, and I'll get into some of that. But I just want to tell you one key idea from the book for about 20 minutes, and then get to questions, because that's always much more interesting than just listening to me waffle on. So my deal is, and a couple of housekeeping points. One is I'm going to be talking about some sensitive issues, and I will warn you accordingly. The second is it's 8 o'clock here in the UK, and I've got a puppy dog that my daughter has just walked, and they've walked in the front door right now, and I can't guarantee the behavior of this 4-month-old whippet called Jessie. Thank you. All right. Yeah, I am a scientist. I'm a geneticist, an evolutionary biologist. And so what that means is that I deal in evolution and genes and DNA. But in the last few years, my work has been focused on talking primarily about race and eugenics, and the sort of quintessential role that science and the history of science has played in the invention of race. And also the enactment of eugenics policies all over the world. And I wrote this book kind of because I felt compelled to, because the culture has changed. We've seen the rise of nationalist politics in the States with the election of President Trump, in the UK with Brexit, and 10 years of an ever-increasing right-wing government. As a result of that, there have been lots of public conversations about race are basically on the increase. And although I've written about race and eugenics in previous works, what I'm fundamentally interested in is human biology and human evolution. But you can't not talk about race if you're talking about human genetics, because the human genome is the ocean from which human diversity and human difference is drawn. And it's really written to people with the knowledge of the history of science and the history of race science as well, the arguments about human variation, and to sort of now I just had a message. It was unstable. Is this are you picking me up? Is this okay? Just give me a thumbs up if it's fine.
A little bit cutting in and out a little bit on your voice.
Shall I move? I'm going to move. I'm going to go closer to the wife.
So.
This is how super professional I am.
Well, if it makes anybody feel better about it, feeling unprofessional, I'm standing in my bedroom right beside my closet. So this is the world we live in right now. And it's so ironic that we're here talking about science, and we have, two guys who probably aren't the most internet inclined people helming the show, but.
Right. Well, that should be better.
Perfect.
And I think that should be more stable. So sorry about that little interlude. Now you've met my dog. Now this is my writing partner, Hannah Fry, who you've probably heard of. We're writing a book together right now, and she's just typing away in the corner. Okay. Anyway, so what I was talking about right then was that if you talk about genetics, then you talk about human genetics and human evolution, then you cannot avoid talking about race, because they are ideas which are historically linked, and they're also linked in contemporary genetics. And what we've begun to see in the last few years is a sort of resurgence of the types of ideas that were first formulated in the 16th and 17th century as pseudoscience are beginning to return as a means of trying to justify racial stereotypes or racial bigotry or outright racism in some cases. And even though the history of science is entirely wedded to European expansionism and colonialism, the age of enlightenment, we call it fondly, but it's also the age of exploitation and plunder and slavery. The history of my field is intrinsically tied to that. But the trajectory of that history is that human genetics is the subject that has demonstrated the falsity, the biological falsity of race. And it's that trajectory which is something to be proud of. So let me just bring up some of the slides I want to show you to talk about some of these issues. So let me just do this. And I believe this is the slideshow I want to show you. So let me just get to the beginning of this. Okay, so yeah, there's the cover of the book. So it's just come out in the States. I'd love it if you took a look at it in one of those independent bookshops. So yeah, some of the ideas, the reasons, the motivations for writing this book at this time is that we have this changing political atmosphere, which I've talked about a bit. We've also had a massive boom in the maturation of human genetics in the last 20 years. It was 20 years ago, 2 weeks ago, that the human genome was first completed. President Bill Clinton was on the stage with Prime Minister Tony Blair announcing that we had, for the first time, read the language of God, which is a pretty bold statement, regardless of your religious sensibilities. Now, there's also been a sort of matching popular interest in genetics, which is great for people like me, because I love talking about this more than anything else. One thing that we didn't predict is the enormity of the commercial genetics market, which just didn't exist really 10 years ago at all, maybe not really 5 years ago. So these are companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, and companies that you spit in a tube and you send it off to the company, and they will send you back a map of where your ancestors come from. It's worth pointing out that there is no scientific method that allows that to be done. What they're telling you is where you have similar DNA to people on Earth today, and from that you infer your ancestry. Now, the concept of racial purity is absolutely central to doctrines of white supremacy and neo-Nazis, and so the organizations or web discussions forums like Stormfront, or places like 4chan or 8chan when it was up, absolutely obsess about concepts of genetic purity that they think can be justified via these sorts of tests, incorrect as they are. And then, of course, it was all written and finished. The UK version came out in February. And then in March, the world turned upside down and COVID happened. And this was a disease and a pandemic that was immediately racialized in two distinct ways. The first was that the origin of the disease, it coming from Wuhan in China, the racialized attacks based on that are so numerous, more than 3,000 in the US, mostly on Chinese American citizens, but also on Korean American citizens, which is, that's the nature of hatred is not particularly logical. But they're also global. A kid from my own university, University College London, was beaten back in February on Oxford Street in central London. So that was one way that it was racialized, and very much not helped by various politicians, including the president, using racialized epithets to describe it, which he continues to do, such as calling it the China virus, and worse, which I won't say. But it was racialized in a second way, which is enormously significant, which is that as early as March, we were beginning to see that in the UK, Black and Asian people, and in the US, Black, Asian, and Latino, Hispanic people were much more susceptible to infection and indeed susceptible to death from COVID-19. As soon as this began to happen, I started, as someone who talks about race and genetics in public, I started being contacted from people suggesting that this was a demonstration of the biological reality of race. And many attempts have been made in the press and in various ways to try and explain this huge racialized disparity in infection rates and death rates. Now, the problem with this, and bear in mind that I've written a new introduction, there's an extra sort of, I think it's 2,500 words at the beginning of the book that you might buy, which brings it up to date and also brings in the Black Lives Matter demonstrations and issues that followed on from George Floyd's death. The fact of the matter is that medicine is racialized enormously already, independent of COVID. And if you look at the socioeconomic status of the people that are most likely to be infected, that it carries way beyond COVID-19 for various reasons, which are all socioeconomically moderated rather than biologically mediated. So what that means is things like, well, those groups of people are more likely to live in urban centers, they're more likely to live in multi-generational families in close housing proximity, they're much more likely to have key worker jobs and therefore not able to lock down or self-isolate. In multi-generational families, they're much more likely to live with older people who are more susceptible to infection and death in any way. And the reason I can say these things with such confidence about COVID is because they are the same for all diseases that are infectious. And so the explanation of the racialization of this particular virus applies across pretty much any infectious disease, because medicine is already racialized before this pandemic began to unfold. And yet, in the media, in social media, in the press, lots of people are really clamoring for a biological basis for this disparity, which is much more easily explained by socioeconomic disparities that already exist and are already really well understood in society. So that brings the book up to date. I only finished writing that about 6 weeks ago before it went to press. It's a short book. It's a deliberately short book. I want it to be punchy and pugnacious, but also, like I said, it's a toolkit for having discussions with, not only with, actual racists on social media, which I don't really advise doing that because it's not very fun or productive. But I'm much more interested in tackling racialized stereotypes that are held by people who don't consider themselves to be racist, who aren't, active white supremacists. And so, they're your uncle or aunt or grandparents or friends who you sit around the Thanksgiving table with or in the pub, and you get into conversations where often about what we call positive attribute racism. So things that are desirable that get racialized, such as sport, right? And tonight, so the 4 chapters of the book are the origin of race, which I've sort of mentioned in the 17th century and onwards, concepts of racial purity, race and sport, which I'm just going to briefly touch on before we get to questions. Race and intelligence is probably the most incendiary and complex subject in the whole of science and warrants multiple lectures on it alone. So I'm not going to go in there. unless you ask me specific questions about that. So I'm just going to talk about just a couple of things about race and sport for the next few minutes. Now, before I get to that, here's a really important thing. I mentioned the trajectory of my field going from being founded with racist principles at their heart to genetics, biology more broadly, being this singular academic subject that has demonstrated the biological falsity of race. Sometimes we, including me and well-intentioned people, express that notion with what's on screen now, which is that race does not exist. Now, this is untrue, and I really want to stress this. It is untrue and it is not helpful. Race absolutely does exist. It's just that it exists as a social construct, is how we describe it, rather than a biological reality. What we know about human variation as a result of studying human DNA, genomics, my field, is that the way we categorize people using the folk taxonomy of race does not align with any form of grouping or variation that we see around the world based on genetics or understanding of human evolution. I don't think it's helpful to say that race does not exist. It exists because it is a social construct. And bear in mind, some people in many situations have used this as a sort of argument against me or against this whole sort of topic, the notion that it is a biological falsity, by saying it's just a social construct. You say, race is just a social construct, it's merely a social construct. I don't buy this as an argument at all. Almost all human interactions are social constructs. You have very few biological interactions with people over the course of your life, and you can interpret that as you wish. Time is a social construct. Money is a social construct. You don't get people saying, I'm not going to pay you because money is a social construct and is not a physical reality. Try turning up to a meeting late and saying, well, I'm not sorry I'm late because time is a social construct. Race is a social construct, and that makes it, that is why it's important. We self-define, we self-identify. The fact that these are culturally mediated categories rather than biologically mediated categories is of enormous significance and great importance. But it doesn't mean that biology is the mediating factor in determining our races. Let me talk about sports for a bit. Now, I recognize that many people aren't into sport, right? And I actually had to persuade my editor in the UK that this was a legitimate way to make up a quarter of this book. I love my sports. I mostly love my UK versions of sport, which are cricket and what you call soccer, but is actually called football. The US version of the book is not merely changing the word football to soccer. I've basically replaced all of the discussion of sport and many other aspects of the book so that they are American relevant. And I talk a lot about basketball, which I adore as a sport, American football, which I don't really understand, but well, see what you make of it for the American football aficionados amongst you. But also I talk about track and field a lot, and also swimming, which I'll come on to, which is really, really important in this discussion. But the reason I think sport is important beyond people who are actually into sport is because it's one of the ways in which we see the abilities of people from around the world. And sport, just like medicine, is heavily racialized. And I argue in the book that it is socially racialized rather than in any significant biological way for various reasons. But even if you're not into sport, a lot of people hold stereotypes about sport that I think are both untrue and also damaging, even if they are positive attributes, racism, as I mentioned a minute ago. So let me just show you this. This is a photo from the book. There's a few photos in the book, and this is what I think is one of the most astonishing photos in the history of photography. That, of course, is Jesse Owens in 1936. Having won, this is just after he's won the long jump. He would go on to win 4 gold medals in these Olympics in the 4 explosive energy track and field sports. And as you can see, there he is in 1936 in Berlin. Adolf Hitler is in the crowd there, and there are tens of thousands of people giving the Nazi salute as Jesse Owens celebrates with just a regular salute. what an astonishing image that is. Somewhat undermined by a quote from his own coach, Dean Cromwell, a few years later, in which he says, "The Negro excels in the events he does because he is closer to the primitive than the white man. It wasn't long ago that his ability to sprint and jump was a matter of life and death to him in the jungle." Right? Now, this is an unequivocally racist sentiment, and this is by Jesse Owens' own coach. Incidentally, there's quite a lot of discussion about how bold it was that he did this in front of Hitler. Hitler, in fact, shook Jesse Owens' hand after this event and after he'd won those golds, but he wasn't invited to the White House. Only white athletes that went to the 36 Olympics from America were allowed to go to the White House. So it was the American president who snubbed Jesse Owens, not Adolf Hitler, which is a really strange thing to be saying. Let me skip forward in time to my favorite athlete of all time, Michael Johnson, the 200 and 400 gold medal winning athlete. Here he is shown in 1996, at one point the fastest man on earth, over 150 meters. Now, Johnson is important to me, not just because he's my favorite athlete of all time, but because in 2012, in the run up to the Olympics that were here in London, just a few miles in that direction from where I'm sitting right now, Johnson was part of the commentating team for the BBC, the organization that I work for and broadcast from. And part of that documentary involved them tracking his ancestry via transatlantic slavery to countries in the west coast of Africa. And this was 2012, so it's the early days of genetic testing for ancestry. And the results are a bit hokey, even more hokey than they are today. But in this program, he said this. He said that all my life I believed I became an athlete through my own determination, but it's impossible to think that being descended from slaves hasn't left an imprint through the generations. Difficult as it was to hear, slavery has benefited descendants like me. I believe there is a superior athletic gene in us. Now, I thought this was interesting and a little bit heartbreaking when I heard him say that, as a result of poorly understood genetics and maybe some misconstrued ideas about the history of transatlantic slavery and the biology that came about as a result of that heinous act, was that he was undermining his own self-determination, his own effort, and attributing his world-beating status to auspicious ancestry more than anything else. But at the same time, so I found that heartbreaking in itself, but at the same time, this is kind of an idea that you can test, right? There's a scientific idea within this. And it's one of the things that I go into in some detail in the book, because I think it's untrue. And I think I demonstrate that it's categorically untrue using contemporary genetics. The first thing is you can think about the genetics from an evolutionary point of view, that what he's talking about there is effectively selection, Darwinian natural or artificial selection, but as a result of breeding programs during slavery and transatlantic slave trade, that somehow genes associated with explosive energy, athleticism, have increased in frequency in Michael Johnson's ancestors, and indeed, as he speculates, all the descendants of the enslaved, the African Americans in America. Now, we can test this now by looking at the whole genomes of any group of people. And indeed, a study last year looked at the genomes of 29,000 African Americans. And it didn't show any evidence of selection, either negative or positive, natural or artificial, for any genes whatsoever, right? So not just of genes associated with sport, with athletic ability, with explosive energies, but it didn't show any selection for any genes whatsoever. So that means that this statement is categorically untrue. The African American genome is distinct from the African genomes from which it has evolved, but that is because the trajectory of that history is both peculiar and different. So it is possible to look at the African American genome and say, we can identify various aspects of this DNA which is different from other people in the Americas and indeed other people from around the world. And that includes increased susceptibility for various diseases, an increase in frequency for diseases such as sickle cell anemia, which is associated not with being black, but having ancestors that evolved alongside malaria. But we do not see any evidence of selection for any of those genes, simply changing gene frequencies through evolutionary history. Now, there's much more details in the science that I could go into. I could talk about this for hours on its own. But the fact is that, as I mentioned before, success in sport, I think, is socially mediated rather than biologically mediated. To get to the top level of sport, you do have to have a biological advantage. You know, people who win the 100 meters or compete in the 100 meters at elite level are biologically different from normal people. You've already selected for genes associated with explosive energy success at a very, very top level. Does that, the question becomes, do those genes exist exclusively or at a significantly higher frequency in a particular racialized group, such as African Americans or the descendants of the enslaved, so to include people from the Caribbean and Canada, who were also have been successful in the last 40 years in short distance track and field? And the answer is, well, no, you don't see a more significant frequency or a greatly more significant frequency in one group of people over another. It is much more easy to explain the racial disparities that we see in sport through social mediations than anything else. And that should be completely obvious, because whilst African Americans or the descendants of the enslaved have dominated in short distance athletics for the last 40 years, they are completely absent in, for example, sprint cycling or squash or tons of other sports that are associated with explosive energy. While African Americans dominate in boxing, they're almost totally absent in wrestling and other contact sports. It takes almost no analysis of sports to see that racialization in sport makes no sense from a biological point of view whatsoever. In football, American football, not soccer, you do see racialized positions a lot. You tend to see running backs tend to be African American, whereas the linebackers, there's a 50-50 split between white Americans and black Americans, apart from in the center position, where 75% of them are white. Now, there isn't a way of explaining that biologically. That has to be a socially mediated thing in a way which we can speculate about, but it is not biological in its basis. Let me skip on, because I'll end up talking about statistics in sport for the next 14 hours, because I can actually do that, but you don't want to hear that. Let me talk about swimming, though, because the contrast between short distance track and field, the 100 meters and the 200 meters, which is utterly dominated by African Americans, the total number of not just African Americans, but black people from anywhere in the world that have ever competed in the Olympics in short distance swimming races is, well, it's these two. It's two, right? There have only ever been two black people in the history of short distance swimming in all of the Olympics through history. Now, again, how do you explain that using biology? Well, there is a racialized stereotype, which is, it goes like this, and some of you will have heard this, which is that black people have denser bones than white people, and that reduces their buoyancy. Now, it pains me to have to say this is absolute nonsense. It's total BS. It may be based on some actuary data about osteoporosis, which itself is not particularly robust, and the details are in the book. But this notion that the almost complete absence of top-level swimmers is as a result of some sort of sinking factor is as stupid as it sounds. But what bugs me about this is that African Americans and Black British people here have bought into this mythologizing themselves. I've got a friend who lives near here who is a very successful cardiac surgeon, so a very biologically educated man who is Nigerian British, and he said it to me, and I was gobsmacked. You can't believe this. You can't think that this is true, and it doesn't just apply to elite athlete status. In America, 70% of African Americans don't swim, compared to 30% of European descended Americans. And that's a huge disparity. So in 2008, Swim America, which is the American swimming official body, did a survey to try and establish why this disparity existed. And every single reason, the top 5, and I'll run down the 5 now, were socioeconomic rather than biological. They go like this, right? Absence of role models. Well, we just talked about that, 2 in the history of swimming. Access to pools. So even after segregation ended in 64, most pools were built in predominantly white areas. Economic reasons, swim classes tend to be extracurricular, so there's just a cash issue there. Having parents or friends who don't swim, you know, it's similar to the role models, but if you don't have parents who swim, it's unlikely that you're going to learn to swim. But the main reason, and it feels absurd to have to even point this out against arguments like black people sink. The main reason that African Americans don't swim in America and indeed the rest of the world is because they haven't been taught how to swim, right? Humans have to learn how to swim. And the single biggest correlating factor between being able to swim is being taught how to swim. And yet we yearn as a society, because this kind of structural racism is baked into our culture, we yearn for some kind of biological buoyancy factor which justifies this enormous racialized disparity that we see in the real world. Now, that is kind of funny, I think. I mean, it's absurd funny, but it immediately becomes much less funny when you realize that the death rate from drowning in African-American kids aged between 8 and 14 is 3 times higher than it is for European descended kids or white kids in America. So this is a kind of structural racism that people buy into with a biological basis, which is completely false, that even African Americans and black people buy into, which is literally lethal. And it makes me angry that we even have to have these conversations when you point out that the most obvious correlate about swimming is just being taught how to swim. Now, let me wrap up so we can get to questions, because I bet there are a few by this point. I just want to say, just briefly, we are an African species, so we evolved in Africa. Most of our evolution occurred in Africa, and then a small proportion of people migrated out of Africa about within the last 100,000 years. And this is the type of map that we show in evolutionary genetics and evolutionary biology to show the migration of people around the world. But I kind of prefer this one, which was produced by colleagues of mine at UCL, which is scaled to show genetic diversity. So what that means is the amount of differences between people as registered in genomes rather than physical characteristics. And it's a recapitulation of the former map, but I think in a much more evocative way, because what it shows very clearly is that almost all human variation at a biological level, at a genetic level, occurs within Africa. And the further you migrate away from Africa, the more reduced that variation goes. We know this now, we're beginning to discover this now, because only in the last few years, in the last 10 years in any real sense, have we begun actually looking in Africa at the genomes of African people. And remember, you know, this is a huge generalization when we talk about a continent which consists of 54 countries and 1.3 billion people. And what we now know from studying some of those people is that there is more variation in pigmentation in Africa than in the rest of the world. And pigmentation was the primary determinant of the racialization categories that were invented in the 17th century by my biological forebears. We know that by looking at the genes of pigmentation, that there is more diversity in pigmentation genes than in the rest of the world put together. And we also know that both light and dark pigmentation genes actually predate Homo sapiens by something like 900,000 years. So we were varied in our pigmentation before we were even Homo sapiens. That is my dog who's just jumped up on the sofa exactly the right time, because this is my final slide. So there's lots to talk about in there. There's lots of complex arguments about history and about genetics and how they relate to our socialized ideas of race, and how those ideas are absolutely baked into our culture. And what I intend to do with this book is to equip people with contemporary science and an understanding of history, so that those conversations are weaponized. You are equipped to point out the fallacies that are both well-intentioned or sometimes overtly racist. And I think that it's important that I just mentioned that partly the book is for my colleagues as well. It's for scientists, because we sometimes shy away from dealing with the political ramifications of our work. And I don't think that's good enough, because this stuff is non-controversial within the academy. I recognize that when I talk to publics, sometimes it's new, sometimes it's complex science, which requires, skill and concentration to unpick. But I think that scientists need to be better at talking about these types of topics in confident ways, because even though science was born in a time of racism and a time of European expansionism, colonialism, and founded by racists, today science is no ally to racists whatsoever. Race is real because we perceive it, and racism is real because we enact it, but neither of those two things are founded in science. And I think it is our duty as scientists and citizens to contest the bastardization of my science. Basically, I'm saying, you can be a bigot if you want to, but you can't have my tools to prop yourself up. And this is the phrase, this is the quote that I like to end with from Angela Davis, that really nails that point home, that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Wiley, and I probably went on for way too long anyway.
No, thank you, Adam. I love that. One of the things you said at the end, race is real because we perceive it, and racism is real because we enact it. I think that is like a perfectly distilled idea to part with. But we do have time for a couple of questions. And if you folks do have questions, make sure to type them in the chat box, include your name and your home bookstore. But the first question we have is from Bruce, whose home bookstore is the Avid Bookshop in Athens, Georgia. And he writes about the fact that you are a highly educated scientist, but you're writing books for a more general audience. What are some of the challenges you face in condensing? And you wrote a very slender book that gets right to the points you're trying to make. How do you condense all of this research and titrate it down into digestible information for a general audience?
Well, carefully, I think, is the answer to that. Well, it is hard, and I think this is mea culpa, because I represent a community of researchers in the UK and to a certain extent around the world, as a science communicator, as a geneticist as well. That I think that we have not successfully conveyed ideas that are non-controversial within our community. We have not successfully conveyed them to a general public, and that's exactly what this book is intended to be. It does mean that you have to embrace some of the more difficult ideas. It does mean, it requires concentration, but nothing good comes from no effort. And I think if you're serious about these issues, then you don't just read. I'm not pretending I'm going to cure racism with this book. I'm lucky enough to be part of a sort of cadre of books and ideas that have come out in the last few years, and then were suddenly sort of propelled into the limelight during the last 6 months as a result of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and so on. And I'm very proud to be part of that. Mine has a particular angle, which is to look at the science, and it has that provocative title deliberately to draw, to get people's attention. But I think, if you're serious about this, and that Angela Davis phrase, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be anti-racist. It means listening to Black people. It means listening to people who write about race, about their experiences, and trying to engage with the lived experiences of people, and trying to engage with the history, and in my case, trying to engage with the science. Because the science is absolutely intrinsically intertwined with the creation of race, which really is only 300 or 400 years old. And I think if you don't know that, I think many people in my field don't know that. Like it's non-controversial amongst race historians and historians more broadly, but a lot of geneticists are unaware of their own history, and I think it's really important that we get tooled up to be able to talk about these things honestly. Another issue, which I'll just mention briefly, is we're in an era where we're reevaluating lots of our historical figures. That is happening a lot in the UK, and I know it's happening a lot in your country too. I think we have to be mature enough to recognize that people can be great in one domain and terrible in another. And the history of science is absolutely littered with people whose scientific contributions have been world-changing and field-founding, and whose work we absolutely rely on to this day, who also were terrible human beings with awful racist views. And I think we need to be good at recognizing those two things can exist simultaneously.
So to close us out, I have a question about, I know you focused mainly on sport today, but Jane from Fernandina Beach, a Story and Song is her home bookstore. She asks about, you talked about swimmers, nobody taught them to swim. Can we extrapolate that example in terms of education, specializations like engineering, math, science, technology? Or do we have a paucity of Black representation in those fields for the same reasons that we do in the swimming pool?
Yes, is the answer to that. This is the concept of structural racism that I think a lot of people think about racism as being, name calling, abusive name calling, and the expression of violence against particular groups of people, which is racism and definitely does exist. But I think the if not bigger, but greatly significant problem is that our entire societies are built on racialized grounds. And that is because of expansionism and because of colonialism. And there's a key phrase that I wrote in this book, which I didn't invent. I copied it off a friend of mine who writes actually about feminism, and I attributed it to her, and she said she didn't invent it either. But it's so powerful. I want to attribute it to someone, but it's difficult to attribute it to anyone because it's such a key idea. And it's this. It is the sentence that if all you have known is privilege, then equality feels like oppression. And that, in many ways, encapsulates the sort of singular problem with structural racism, that the lived experiences of Black people or any minority group in a culture which has been built around the support of not that group, of the dominant power, it's very difficult to recognize your own privilege. It's very difficult. It's a hard thing to say, well, me and you are men, right? So that immediately puts us in a more privileged category than 50% of the world, right? Me and you are, for example, both I'm guessing this, but descended from, we have modern European descent in us, which also puts us in a high privilege category. And this isn't a game of oppression Olympics is what it gets trivialized as, but who is more oppressed than others. That's not the point of this. It is simply to recognize that structural biases, and in what we're talking about is structural racism here, is so baked into our culture through history that it takes effort to recognize that it even exists. Mm-hmm. And that's the first step to trying to fix it, which is why, that's why we're here. That's what we're talking about, because we recognize this is fundamentally problematic for a stable and functioning society. And therefore we have to make effort to fix it. But it does take effort. And that's incumbent on all of us.
And I would argue that effort to close this out is the difference between a non-racist and an anti-racist. The effort is in the word anti, to systematically attack that which has systematically attacked others throughout the course of human civilization.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. It is going to take effort, and I'm glad and proud to be part of at least this, like I say, sort of phalanx of books and ideas that are beginning to talk about this more openly. I did not celebrate, but I'm grateful that, here in the UK, the book went back into the top 5 bestsellers during the height of the demonstrations, the international demonstrations for Black Lives Matters. And I remember, at roughly the same time, the New York Times top 10 was all books for a couple of weeks about these types of issues. That is a hopeful and a positive sign. It means that these are ideas that people want to engage with and that people are willing to, get on the team, to switch from being non-racist to being anti-racist, and being, it's an old but brilliant cliche, but to not be part of the problem, but to be part of the solution.
And I don't want to end on the cynical note, but I think it is hopeful to point out that these massive corporate structures are choosing to showcase and push books like these as well. Whereas even 10, 15 years ago, that would have been totally unexpected. And
right. And
awesome.
You know what? I have a cynical streak in me. I wouldn't be British if I didn't. And I've thought about this quite hard. And it's easy to recognize fashions and trends in big corporations, or I do a lot of work in Hollywood or on TV, and recognize that all of a sudden, people are casting more women and more people of color and so on. It's easy to be cynical about that, but that's where it starts. Mm-hmm. You have to make those positive statements, which may feel clunky and clumsy, and may generate animosity from some people, that you're being overtly politically correct, or that there is positive discrimination in certain domains. But that's what happened in '64, right? That is what happened. That is what the civil rights movement was about. It was about deliberately changing policy in order that things were better. And I don't know about, there presumably are very few people today who think that what happened in the '60s with the civil rights movement was a bad thing. That was progress, right? So maybe these things are clunky, maybe these things are clumsy, and maybe they feel uncomfortable to a lot of people. Well, I think to a certain extent, we've all just got to suck that up and hope that they become normalized. Because when we normalize these things, that is when we have real change.
Yeah. And they will be normal for my daughters. And I know you said earlier you had a daughter just a moment ago. Well, thank you so much, Adam. That was enlightening and emboldening and interesting and so well done. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you want to purchase Adam's book, please purchase it from the independent bookstore that brought you to today's event. And please return to your bookstore and request an invitation to join us on Thursday evening for Justin A. Reynolds. He has a new YA novel out called Early Departures. We'll be with him live at 7 p.m. Thursday evening. Justin A. Reynolds. I'm Wiley Cash. This has been SIBA Reader Meet Writer. We will see you next time.